Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So children may be the least at risk of getting severely ill or dying from COVID-19, but in some ways, they felt the impacts of the pandemic harder than any other demographic group. School closures, in a lot of cases, have meant a complete loss of structure and being away from their friends and teachers for months. That's on top of the general stress of the pandemic over their own health and that of their families. According to a study published in the medical journal The Lancet last month, around the world, 1.5 million children lost a mother, father, or another caregiving relative to COVID-19. A lot of parents have been worried about the long-term impacts of this time on their children's mental health and asking if their kids are all right. And according to a massive report published by the Royal Society of Canada in August, the answer is not really.
We're on the cusp of a generational catastrophe. We really are. Scientists are going to be studying children from this point in time for years to come, and they'll be studying their children.
Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt is the co-author of that report. She's a psychology professor and Canada Research Chair in Children's Mental Health and Violence Prevention at the University of Ottawa. Tracy's on the show, and that's today on the Decibel. Let's get into it. Hi, Tracy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Tamara.
So, Tracy, children's mental health was a concern in Canada even before the pandemic, long before the pandemic. So, to start off, can you give me an idea of what the state of affairs was in terms of the challenges that children were dealing with around mental health and in terms of the kind of support that was available to them?
So before the pandemic, about 1 in 5 children and youth met diagnostic criteria for a mental disorder. So we're not talking about a little bit of anxiety or a little bit of a depression. We're talking about a clinician has diagnosed them with depression or anxiety. So that's a notable amount, right? 1 in 5. And of those children, only a quarter were receiving services in Canada. And the ones that were receiving services typically were the ones that had externalizing problems. So they're quite obvious to teachers, they're quite obvious to parents, to members of the community. And so they tend to be the ones that receive services. Not just because they're more obvious to others, but also they tend to be a nuisance to others in some ways, right? And I'm not suggesting, don't want to stigmatize children who have externalizing problems. Obviously, this is a difficult situation for the child and for the families and schools in which they're participating in. But this is probably the main reason is because, their behavior is so obvious and violates in some ways the rights of others. So then you have this whole segment of the population with mental health difficulties that are internalizing in nature that are suffering in silence. So they tend to be more compliant. These are the kids that are quiet in the classroom. They're not getting into the face of others. They're not bothering the teacher. So they tend to not be identified and not receive services.
Wow, 1 in 5 is a very staggering number. And when you say disorders, what does that mean? Can you unpack that a little bit more for me? You mentioned depression and anxiety. What else might children have been dealing with?
So mental health disorders tend to be lumped into internalizing problems, which is depression and anxiety, and then externalizing problems, which tends to be things like ADHD, conduct problems, oppositional defiance disorder. And then there's other mental health issues, such as eating disorders. They're more common in adolescents than they are in children. And those have been very, very prominent during the pandemic, eating disorders. So that's kind of how we categorize things. And then what makes something a disorder versus just like subclinical is that there's distress and or disability.
Right. So this was the situation pre-pandemic. And then what changed for children during the pandemic? And before we even get to the mental health consequences, I wonder if you can take us through the different ways that children felt the impacts of this pandemic.
The most obvious one would be school closures, especially in Ontario. This is where we saw the bulk of school closures. Children were isolated from their peers, from their teachers. A lot of times they were isolated from extended family, friends, and the like. But there was other things too. I mean, we took away their sports. We took away their extracurricular activities. A lot of them thought that if they caught COVID, they were going to jeopardize their family's health and wellness. They also experienced the stressors that their parents were dealing with, job security, food security, you name it. There was a reported increase in child maltreatment, a reported increase in intimate partner violence during the pandemic. All of the safety nets that we used to have in place were removed. So you couple that with the fact that they were already vulnerable to begin with, and then you take away all of the things that are kind of keeping them somewhat safe, you can appreciate that things weren't going to turn out well.
And what were the consequences of all of these changes on the mental health of children?
So it was really difficult to pinpoint at first because, first of all, I think we had a little bit of hope, right? So if you think back to when the pandemic first occurred, and you're a thoughtful person and you're in the news, so you're reading this often, you were probably thinking, 5 months at most, right? So there was hope.
Yeah.
So I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't see what we see now. And that makes sense because we had no idea where we were headed. Then the stressors started to compound, and then we started to see mental health difficulties. So it's really interesting because this is such a moving target. And I think this is what makes it so contentious because people will use studies that were from the beginning of the pandemic and say, no, we didn't cause any harm. But if you look at studies that have, examined this throughout the past 2 years, you see that no, harm did occur. And I expect that we're going to see the harm to last generations, potentially.
And what specifically are we talking about? I mean, can you just give me some examples of the kinds of changes that we've seen at this point? What has happened?
They're not doing well in terms of their mental health, so more anxiety, more depression, more eating disorders, more loneliness, more suicidal thought, more suicidal gestures. But they're also suffering in terms of academic achievement. It basically affects virtually all aspects of their functioning, including physical health. We saw more sedentary behavior, more screen time, increases in weight gain. So it's not just mental health that this affected.
So you mentioned how this is contentious, and I didn't realize that was the case. But, now that I think about it, I do hear a lot of people say kids are so resilient. And I wonder what you think when you hear that and what you think when you hear people say this is normal, kids are going to bounce back. What does the research actually say about how resilient kids are?
Some children are resilient, but not all children are resilient. So if we make a blanket statement like that, then we're really going to cause harm. And I think that misnomer, this perception that all children are resilient, is actually making them more vulnerable. The thing about resilience is it's a balancing act, right? So if you have a lot of stressors, but you have some coping mechanisms, it's balanced. But if you have more stressors than you do resources, coping mechanisms and resources, then that balance is askew. And, we see, again, the distress and disability that I talked about earlier. But what I don't think we've appreciated is at what point does that balance become unbalanced? And so, when it comes to children's mental health, 2 + 2 doesn't always equal 4. And what I mean by that is that the stressors are not additive often, they're exponential and they're synergistic. So what you have now is 2 + 2 equals 2,000 or 20,000. So it seemed like they were doing fine and they were doing fine. And all of a sudden, just one little push and they're over that cliff or that clinical marker that puts them into a very vulnerable position.
Yeah. And you mentioned that children who were already vulnerable may have been hit harder by this, but I wonder, when you look at things like age and race and socioeconomic status, were children hit the same way across the board, or did some feel the impacts of this more than others?
Definitely some children and teens felt it worse. And it seems to be always the same children and youth who are disproportionately affected by stressors like the pandemic. So we know that children who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to be more vulnerable. Children who come from racialized backgrounds are more vulnerable. In particular, Indigenous boys in Canada are more vulnerable when we look at things like suicide. We also know that children who identify as LGBTQ plus are more vulnerable. So those children are still more vulnerable during the pandemic. And so we already have children vulnerable, and then we throw on top of that this huge stressor, a pandemic. On top of that, we throw on all these demographic variables that make them even more vulnerable. And then put on top of that this misperception that they're going to be resilient. Think about that message too. So if everybody tells you you're going to be okay, Tamara, you're going to be okay, you're resilient, you're young, and then you're not okay, then how do you seek help, right? Everybody told you you should be okay. Now, we could flip that and say, well, if we keep telling everybody they're not going to be okay, then in a sense, we're setting them up for failure there too. So we need to be balanced in what we're saying, and we need to be thoughtful.
So I know of kids, like siblings of friends, for example, who actually liked remote learning and they thrived in online classes and learning from home. And I wonder if there are situations in which kids benefited from not being at school.
Absolutely. At the beginning of the pandemic, I often talked about this with colleagues. If you had social anxiety disorder, you were doing better during the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic. The challenges that are associated with that disorder, speaking in front of others, the peer pressure and the like, were removed, right? You could participate in class with your camera off. And kids who are bullied. So part of my job is looking at bullying, and bullying went down a lot during the pandemic. So the rates are a lot better. They're the best I've ever seen in the 20 plus years I've been studying this issue. So if you were being bullied and now you didn't have to go to school and face your tormentor or tormentors, certainly that would have been better for you.
So what do children lose, or what did they lose when they didn't have that FaceTime with their teachers?
Oh, it's amazing. So I think most people, not everybody, educators have long known that education is not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic, that in fact the first R of education would be relationships. Cognition is socially mediated, which means that children learn through peer interactions and interactions with their educators, with their teachers and the like. And so they've lost so much. But schools don't just provide that part of education. They're also the first place to detect child maltreatment and neglect, right? So teachers know when something's amiss in that area. They also schools provide sustenance for children who don't have meals or, who aren't fed adequately. They provide mental health services. A lot of people don't think about that, but the primary avenue for the provision of mental health services is through schools. And now that's removed. And then on top of that, we've got all of the other stressors that come with the pandemic.
So what do you think is at stake if we keep going down this road without an improvement in mental health services and with these continued disruptions to education as this pandemic continues to rage on across the country?
We're on the cusp of a generational catastrophe. We really are. Scientists are going to be studying children from this point in time for years to come, and they'll be studying their children. So it's not going to be a good outcome. We need to start thinking about children. And I think children have been neglected during the pandemic. So in some ways, because they didn't get as sick as adults, they were ignored. And they were also ignored because of this misperception that they're resilient, that they're going to bounce back. But they're our most vulnerable. Children and seniors are our most vulnerable in society. And yet we ignored both segments of that vulnerability continuum.
Yeah. And so when you say generational catastrophe, what do you imagine? Like, what does that look like?
I think it looks like more mental health problems than we already have and not able to manage. And those things persist, right? So 50 to 75% of adult disorders began in childhood and adolescence. And mental health problems are the leading cause of disability worldwide, of health burden worldwide. So this is a huge issue already, and it's a huge issue in adults. So we don't want to have this continuity of mental health problems from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. Parents who have mental health difficulties, they're trying their best to parent their children well, but there's certainly some risks associated with that as well. So what happens to their children then? And then we have the physical health front too. Educational attainment is going to get hit. We have children in Canada that didn't even log on once to Zoom. They didn't show up to class once. And that would never happen outside of a pandemic, or very, very rarely happen, because we have safeguards to make sure that doesn't happen. You're legally compelled to attend school until you're a certain age in Canada. Poor educational attainment leads to poorer job prospects, leads to lower economic viability and the like. So, like I said, it affects everything.
So what do you think we should be looking at and prioritizing in terms of solutions to this crisis?
So we need to prioritize children's mental health. And I actually think we should be prioritizing it in schools. And the reason why is because we in Canada use a step care approach. And a step care approach means that the least expensive, easiest sort of part of the step care is prevention. So can we get a whole bunch of kids to not become depressed, to not become anxious? And we have programs that are efficacious that could be delivered in schools to make sure that happens. And then the next step in that would be, seeing a psychologist or a social worker. And then the highest step, the most expensive step, is being treated in a tertiary care unit in a hospital. And that's where kids are going today, because they can't access therapists, they can't access anybody in school, they're vulnerable, they're isolated, they're alone. So we need to prioritize school-based mental health. We need to put money in it. We need to have a national program. There's enough evidence that we could mount a program for all Canadian children that would work. It's not going to work for all children, but it certainly will help. And that's not happening right now. It depends on the province and their interest in this topic, and that's not good enough. Can you imagine having a regional approach to dealing with diabetes? Does that even make sense?
No.
And yet we have a regional approach to dealing with children's mental health. Doing it in schools works because that's where they are. It's more discreet. There's less stigma. Everything's there. Now, your listeners might be teachers and saying, oh my goodness, don't do this to us. We already have enough, right? We're doing everything. And now you're telling me I need to be a psychologist as well? No, absolutely not. We could do some training with educators on some basics, but we can also hire people to do this within schools. And then, the taxpayers who are listening to this and say, this sounds really expensive. It's really expensive? Having kids show up at the ER with their mental health issues. And when over 20% of the population has it, and it's even higher now because of COVID, that's extremely expensive. So this is actually a cheaper way of dealing with it.
So a lot of kids are returning to school this week. And so what should parents expect, do you think, in terms of how they might be feeling? Is there something that parents can be doing to make this transition back easier?
It's a tough transition. I think some of the things that we could do as parents is always check in with our children, and especially our teenagers. They don't want us to do it, or they pretend they don't want us to do it, but it's a really good idea. Just check in. How are you doing? I know this is tough. I care about you. The other thing too is that we need to understand that children are not little adults. So the way you process information and the way I process information is not the way they process information. And we need to get away from that idea. So for example, when they hear that they can infect an adult in their community and they might die, children, their risk appraisal on that is not going to be adjusted appropriately. So you may have a very, very worried child who is not telling you how worried they are, and having the conversation with them means that they can have better information, that the child will be able to process the information and the risk a lot better, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing that parents should be looking for is a change in baseline, and that's really key. So for depression, for example, is your child sleeping more, sleeping less, crying more, eating more or eating less, more irritable? Do they talk about the future less? Do they seem like they have no more motivation? That sort of thing.
Okay, Tracy, I think people will find that really, really helpful. Thank you so much for this conversation. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to our guest, Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt. Dr. Vaillancourt is the Canada Research Chair in Children's Mental Health and Violence Prevention at the University of Ottawa. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.